This episode of Keys to the Shop is brought to you by Prima Coffee. Whether it's espresso machines, manual brewing devices, or general coffee shop needs, they seek to pursue the most innovative coffee products, both domestic and abroad, to offer their customers. Find out more at prima-coffee.com. This is Keys to the Shop, episode 60, Serving the Coffee Plant, with Hanna Neuschwander of World Coffee Research. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I'm your host for the show, and I'm glad you decided to join us today. I want to thank our sponsor here at Keys to the Shop, Prima Coffee. Prima is a specialty coffee equipment supplier, and they're based out of Louisville, Kentucky. And since the beginning of their business, they have set out to make the best coffee brewing equipment available to the general public. And their focus is on curating the best equipment for every need, from grinders to espresso machines to under-counter fridges. Pretty much anything you can think of. They truly do curate the equipment that they carry. They put such great effort into making sure that they are offering the best around. And they put a big emphasis on having the expertise to help their customers get the right gear to fit every situation. You can see what they have to offer by going to prima-coffee.com, and there you will find just a ton of great gear and equipment. They have a ton of great resources, too, on the website where you can find out more about the equipment that they sell, how to use it, the ins and outs, and stuff like that. Just a great group of people doing great things for the coffee industry. So go to prima-coffee.com and tell them I said hello. My thanks again to Prima for their support of Keys to the Shop and of the coffee community by giving us the tools we need to do our jobs well. So this is episode 60 of Keys to the Shop. It's just, we're getting older by the week, and it's hard to believe there's been 60 episodes since January, but here it is, and I've learned a lot over the year, and I hope you have too, and I really want to thank you for being a fan of the show and coming here and listening. If it's your first time with us, Keys to the Shop, I really hope you get a lot out of today's episode, and it's a really great subject, great guest to kind of ring in 60 episodes with. We are talking about the coffee plant and the coffee bar, how the two have evolved next to each other and influenced one another over the years. And the world of coffee agronomy is a fascinating one, and a lot of the time it can seem somewhat distant to the average retail coffee worker. Even today, as we have more transparency and information and communication, more of that than ever before, it's kind of hard to link up those two bookends of the industry, the coffee farm and the coffee bar, in a way that's more than just distant acknowledgement. Now, how can we in retail positively impact the coffee producing link in the chain of quality from where we sit in our stores, in our labs, in our roasteries? And one way we can move forward effectively is by looking back to see what kind of relationship the two sides have had, for better or for worse, together, and understanding a little bit more about what's going on right now with coffee agronomy, the struggle on the farm level, and how it impacts us and our customers. Now, today, to help us look deeper into these things, we are talking with Hanna Neuschwander, who is the Director of Communications for World Coffee Research. So Hanna is based in Portland, Oregon, and she is one of the world's foremost explainers of coffee and coffee science. And whether she's explaining the impact of climate change or talking about coffee genetics or coffee brewing, just the intersection of coffee and science is her passion. And she writes on a regular basis, and she speaks globally about the future of coffee and coffee agriculture. She is the author of over 50 articles on coffee, and she's the author of Left Coast Roast, a book touring coffee shops on the West Coast. It's a really great book to pick up. So I'm really excited to have Hanna on the show to give us some insights and information about what's going on the farm level, and to educate us on ways that things have been going, and give us some direction, momentum, and inspiration to affect the way things are going to go in the future. So without further ado, I will bring you to my conversation with the Communications Director of World Coffee Research, Hanna Neuschwander. Hanna, welcome to Keys to the Shop. I'm really excited to have you here. How are you?
I am great. I'm very excited to be talking to you.
Yeah, I have listened to all of your talks, and I am super impressed with just the amount of knowledge I come away with in the RICO talks and in just this whole world of coffee science that you're known for speaking to, and in your job at the World Coffee Research Organization. And I mean, you just have such a wide range of experience in the industry on both sides, actually. I wonder if you could, start us off here and tell us about your adventures exploring, coffee roasters and retailers, because you wrote a book about it, West Coast Roast, which I have on my desk right now, actually. And also now you are the one of the leading speakers on coffee science with World Coffee Research. So how did this all kind of get started for you?
Well, so I started, I think, where most people start their adventure in coffee. I was a barista. Back in 2007, my husband and I had just moved to Portland, Oregon, and didn't really know anybody, and needed to get out of the house a little bit. We were young, in our 20s, and I thought, I'll get a job at a coffee shop. That'll be a great way to get to know people and get to know the city. And it was. But I also just happened to luck into a particular moment, right? 2007 in Portland, you had this sort of beginning of this explosion of micro roasters. There was a tremendous amount of energy and interest in coffee, and this whole kind of new approach to thinking about coffee, or new-ish approach to thinking about coffee, which is focused a lot on the story behind the coffee and the really unique qualities of different kinds of coffees. I remember vividly going to taste Panama Esmeralda Geisha when Stumptown first carried it in 2006 and being like, what is this?
Oh yeah, that was an amazing coffee.
Yeah, it was an amazing moment to step into this world. Simultaneously, though, my background, my training, my career aspirations were all about communication. I was an English major in college, and I had worked in the publishing industry. And so simultaneously, this is kind of a cool matchup. While I was half-time barista, and I was half-time working at the local alt news weekly, which in Portland is Willamette Week, one of the two. And so I was working in this coffee shop. All this exciting stuff was happening in coffee. So my editor asked me if I would start writing about Portland cafes. So I did, and it was incredibly fun. When you're a journalist, even if you're a kind of low-level journalist like I was, people talk to you. They will tell you all sorts of things about their story and where they came from and how they got to where they are and why they're doing what they're doing. And so I'm interviewing all these, young, excited, enthusiastic, new, many of them, coffee roasters and cafe owners and baristas and stuff like that. And it was just super captivating. I was really intrigued by their stories. A lot of people who had careers in some other place other than coffee, the tech world or the finance world or the art world. And they were not satisfied with the life that they had. And so they took a chance and did this coffee thing. And I thought that was really, really interesting. So I kept writing about coffee, and I kind of evolved my writing about coffee. I started writing for more magazines, and then this really amazing opportunity sort of landed in my lap to write a guidebook to West Coast coffee roasters. And that is the book that's sitting on your desk, West Coast Roast. Mm-hmm. And that was an amazing experience because I got to travel all up and down the West Coast and talk to not just kind of young, upstart, passionate roasters, but also some really old school established folks. Like I interviewed the roast master from Pete's at the time, who had studied under Alfred Peet and had been his apprentice. And I really began to, as I was doing those interviews, begin to kind of peek into a little bit behind the curtain of, well, where does all this coffee come from? How does it get from there to here? What are these stories behind the beans? And And that was kind of the beginning of me falling down the coffee rabbit hole, as I like to call it. And that curiosity has really kind of led me progressively further back or up, or whatever way you want to frame the metaphor, the coffee value chain. So I really started with what was in the cup and what those interesting flavors were, and the service orientation of it, and how to start a new cafe, and all of those things were what captivated me. Design, space design, the culture of a cafe. And then as I kind of began to get a feel for that, I began to become more interested in the coffee itself and the roasting. And then I got a feel for that and began to become more interested in where does it come from and how does it get here? What is the role of an importer? And then before that, it's the farm. What are the challenges that coffee producers face? And through a sort of torturous, long series of events that I won't fully explain, I found myself at World Coffee Research. And I couldn't have found a better place to be for kind of where my curiosity is at right now. I think one of the reason people talk about people are the reason that they are in coffee, that they've built their career here, because it's such an incredible community. And I 100% echo that. But for me, it is also more than that. I think coffee is a profound window onto the world that we live in this kind of modern moment. You can look at almost any aspect of our world through the lens of coffee, whether it's a liberalized global economy, whether it's, ethical questions about rich and poor and North and South countries, whether it's genetics and the genetics revolution, whether it's about women and gender. I mean, you can ask any question about the world and look for answers in coffee. And to me, that I like to say, if you get bored with coffee, it's your own fault, because it is.
That's definitely true. Yeah. But before we get into that more, I wonder, what do you do at World Coffee Research? What is your role there, and what are you working on right now?
Yeah, so my role in particular, I'm the communications director. And so my role is to try to explain what we do to the industry in particular. The coffee industry is where we derive most of our funding. So it's really important that the industry understands why we exist and what it is that we're doing, and the value that we're bringing to the work that you do. And also the sort of general public, like, it's, bonus points if my mom kind of gets what it is that we're working on. So we'll see. You can tell me if I'm doing my job well. So what does World Coffee Research do? So the first important kind of thing to note is that we don't do all kinds of coffee research. We are pretty specifically focused on agricultural research. So things to do with how the plant grows and the conditions that help it thrive. So soil nutrition might be part of that. Farm management practices might be part of that. And even socioeconomics might be part of that. What situation do coffee farmers find themselves in? There are many different kinds of ways to farm coffee and farming systems that farmers use. And some of those produce more or less profit or more or less coffee. And, what are the different barriers that those different kinds of farming systems and farmers face? So there's, the scientific areas that we touch on in our work are pretty broad, from genetics to socioeconomics to chemistry and sensory. However, it is all oriented around this fundamental question of, what are the conditions that allow a coffee farm to thrive? And one of our primary, or really our main areas of focus, is plant genetic improvement. So improving the coffee plant. It's not the only thing that we touch on, but it has been a core focus of ours in our first 5 years. And people might be a little bit surprised to learn that we are only 5 years old. We're just barely, exiting toddlerhood as an organization. But I think we've done a tremendous amount of really good work in those 5 years. But yeah, we're still kind of young. And really the main focus that we have had is on genetic improvement, because it's a very efficient way to deliver impact for farmers. If you can produce a better variety that addresses the needs that farmers have, that addresses the needs that consumers have or buyers have, meaning basically that it tastes good, that's a very that's a very good way to deliver impact to a really large number of people very rapidly. In contrast, for example, soil nutrition matters a lot, right, to the success of your farm. There's a lot of coffee farms around the world that have very, very degraded soil, but it's much more complicated to address soil health because you do have to go farm by farm, because soil is different. The needs of the soil are going to be different. And so it just takes more work. It takes more effort. So not to say that we don't care about soil. We do a lot. And we're going to be starting some work in our next 5 years to address agronomy and agronomic practices, and soil health is a big part of that. But we have started with a focus on the plant and breeding new varieties. Scientists use the term genetic improvement, but it basically means creating new varieties because it's just a very cost-effective, very efficient, very effective way of moving the needle for farmers.
How does it secure the future of coffee to have that as the central question and have that as a central focus? Yeah.
So, I mean, we didn't just randomly come up with this idea. If you look at pretty much all agriculture anywhere, this is a really standard part of any crop sector. So, if you're growing wheat, if you're growing strawberries, if you're growing wine grapes, there is a research and development component behind it where scientists or breeders are out there developing new varieties to meet the needs of farmers and of consumers. And those needs change and evolve, which is one reason why breeding is something you are just do it all the time. It's an ongoing thing. And so just to give you an example of that in coffee, a lot of the breeding work, the kind of earliest modern breeding work that was done in coffee was done in the 60s and 70s. And it was all oriented around addressing the problem of coffee leaf rust, which is a fungal infection that can very negatively impact a farm. You can lose a lot of your crop from it. And so there was quite a lot of work done to create new varieties that were resistant to this rust fungus. But this was the 60s and 70s, and creating new variety takes time. Coffee is a tree crop, so it takes usually about 20 to 30 years to get a new variety from the initial stage until it's ready to be released to farmers.
Wow.
And so all this work was beginning in the 60s and 70s, but the varieties weren't released to farmers until the 90s. That's when they were kind of done with the development work. And that is the exact moment when the specialty coffee market comes into being, and all of a sudden there's a tremendous amount of interest in cup quality and differentiation of cup quality. And cup quality was something that the breeders just hadn't really considered because no one cared about it. There was no signal being sent to them saying, hey, create high cup quality. That's what matters to us. The only signal they had was rust is a problem. Let's fix that. And so that's what they focused on. Doesn't mean you can't create a high cup quality coffee that is resistant to coffee leaf rust. People used to think that those two things were mutually exclusive. They're not. It's just that no one was trying to make those coffees taste good. So that's just an example of how, the needs of consumers changed. The interests of consumers changed. And so breeders are part of the system that helps farmers adapt to meet those changing needs. This hasn't happened, anytime recently in coffee, but new diseases are emerging all the time in various crops. So breeders are there to help farmers meet those challenges when, say, a new strain of rust emerges, or an entirely new disease or pest that never bothered coffee before suddenly begins to be a problem for farmers. They turn their attention to trying to solve that problem. So it's a sort of ongoing process.
So it sounds like a conversation between the two, you could call them bookends of the industry, like the farm level and then the service level. But it doesn't sound like in the 50s and 60s, there was much of a feedback mechanism between people who were consuming coffee and the ones who were making all the decisions. In the 90s, it sounds like that really changed. And so, we go through all of this evolution as an industry. We start to get into, from the first to the second to the third wave and onward, wherever that leads. Mm-hmm. Did that conversation just pick up real fast, and then did it just start there? Or was there conversation from the consumers back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when this all was happening?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The two ends of the loop were not talking to each other. And that is one of the very remarkable and I think very powerful things about the emergence of the specialty industry and about conversations around, for example, direct trade, where you're creating more direct avenues for producers and, if not consumers, at least the buyers of coffee, who go on to roast the coffee and sell it to consumers, to have a conversation about, well, what are your needs and what are your needs? Not all coffee farmers, unfortunately, are able to engage in those conversations. It tends to be ones that, speak English or have more, a little bit more access, whether it's through social media or they come to trade shows or whatever. But still, the emergence of that direct accessibility for farmers to talk to buyers and buyers to talk to farmers, it really did have profound impacts on how we think about coffee agriculture, the kind of feedback loops that, for example, that we're able to have with our breeding program. So our breeding program is very explicitly includes quality, cup quality as a primary consideration, not a secondary or tertiary consideration. And that is completely because of specialty coffee. And because of the value that it drives for farmers as well. It's, you can make more money if you have a high cup quality, and that matters because if we want farmers to keep farming coffee, they have got to be able to make a return on their investment in their farms. And that is not happening for a lot of coffee farmers right now around the world. So, I think that's a really awesome thing. It's not, it's not limited to coffee. I mean, consumers in general are asking many more questions about, well, how does this thing get made? Where does this t-shirt come from? How many steps are there in the supply chain? How do we get more transparency into those processes? And fundamentally, there didn't used to be as many steps in the process, right? And like globalization and the kind of neoliberal 21st century economy that we have, it's pretty dark, a lot of those steps in the middle. And it makes sense that people are pushing back against that and want to know more about it.
Some people I've heard say that coffee is one of the most transparent agricultural products. Would you say that that's true? I've only heard it in a couple of conversations, but as opposed to something like chocolate or, whatever other crop you can think of, is there credence to that?
Yeah, I think for globalized commodity crops, I think that's true. Sugar is an example. Palm oil. Like, do you have any idea how that gets bought or sold? No. It's a little bit less true when you're talking about maybe like a specialty type fruit or vegetable. Like, I know that my strawberries were grown in, California that are in my fridge right now. And I can pretty much imagine how they got to the store where I bought them. That said, there is, coffee has two sides. So there's the kind of, relationship, direct trade, specialty side that has a lot more transparency than it ever has before. There is still a lot of coffee in the world that is bought and sold purely as a commodity. And some of the corners of that universe are still very dark. Just to give you a kind of generic example, this sort of blew my mind when I learned it. There are some very large, mass market coffee companies around the world that, because they're just buying coffee sold by an importer, and the importer's buying it from an exporter, and there's some other middlemen involved in the way there. And there's not tracking on all of that stuff. And the coffee itself is being bulked together at different ports, right? So it's not farm specific. It may not even at a certain point be country specific. And so there are some companies that offer the service of analyzing shipping routes and the volumes of materials that come in through different ports and try to give you basically a guess of where your coffee came from based on that.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a really big range of how coffee works in the world, and it's definitely not the case that all coffee is transparent. But some coffee is extremely transparent. And that is, one of the things that I think is really great about the specialty coffee market and, the kind of progressive conversations that people have driven forward around transparency is that these relatively small companies or these relatively, just strong-willed and vocal individuals can have an outsized impact. I heard once Craig Holt, who's the owner of Atlas Coffee Importers in Seattle, say we are the mice who roar. You know, we're tiny in the scheme of things. The amount of actual coffee that's bought and sold in this way is so small in the global scheme of things, but people listen and consumers listen. And that has a role in driving consumer demand, which also then matters. So if consumers are saying, yep, this matters to us, you start to see larger companies like a McDonald's saying, oh, we need to start telling the story of where our coffee comes from.
Mm-hmm. What is the balance to this? Because it seems like a double-edged sword when you, on one hand, you've got these people that are like, well, just tell us the general direction our coffee came from and, you know, we'll be fine. They're like in the 60s still with what they're doing with coffee. And then there's people who are like, they have a GPS on their bag of coffee right now. They know where it's coming from. And the balance I'm thinking about, like, you can get farmers to make different decisions about what to plant, how to process it based on this smaller part of the industry. But is it sustainable? Because maybe we're talking about a roaster who really values geisha variety. So I'll say the word. And then no one wants to buy it outside this tiny group of people. How do we balance that without selling them a bill of goods that's kind of a fad, for lack of a better word?
Well, so I'll tell you how we balance it as an organization, especially when we're thinking about this question of breeding and varieties and stuff like that. So we would not, at least at this point in our development, we would not create a geisha-like variety to release to farmers that only has appeal or applicability to a very small, relatively, in the scheme of things, group of coffee farmers that is exposed to less risk. You're not going to grow geisha, or you probably shouldn't grow geisha if you're at a low altitude where you're not going to, for example, realize the quality gains of that potential, the genetic potential that's in a geisha. Mm-hmm. And geisha is very expensive to grow. It costs more to buy the plants. It costs more to manage them. They don't yield very much. They're not resistant to some of the major diseases. And to get the quality potential, you have to invest a lot in micro milling and really controlling the processes and, you know, all the separation that happens from microlats. It's very expensive to make money on geisha. So it's only farmers that have a certain tolerance for risk that are able to take on a certain amount of risk that can and should grow a variety like that. Where we are more focusing our effort is the kind of just a step down below that and saying, let's create, we're using sledgehammers, not scalpels. So we're saying, for example, Central America, we have to create rust resistant varieties for Central America. Rust is too big of a problem. It's moving to higher altitudes. We've seen the fallout that can happen when you have the forces kind of collide to produce an epidemic like they did from 2012 to 2015. We have 1.7 million people out of jobs, which is a huge driver of human migration. So surges in illegal immigration, this is obviously an issue in the U.S. So you have organizations like USAID, the development organization of the American government, investing in coffee breeding because they want coffee producers to be profitable and to be successful and not be pushed to migrate. That's a little bit of an aside, but I think it's interesting how these things really do tie into much bigger global conversations. So when we're looking at developing a variety, we are looking at it has to address the core needs of the majority of farmers. It also has to have good cup quality because at this point the market just demands it. So we can't treat them like a trade-off, but it doesn't mean that we're probably not going to be developing a variety that's geisha-like that has really interesting, really unique flavor profiles that are super, super niche. I look forward to a day when there are enough coffee breeders in the world that someone wants to take that on and be, the tomato world has this, right? You've got all these breeders that are like, I'm going to make a tomato that's purple and has zebra stripes. And, and they're really, they're really specialty products and people will pay top dollar for them. There's just not enough breeding being done. There's not enough funding for this work to address all the full spectrum of things. So we're looking at, how do we create the largest amount of impact for the largest amount of farmers who are at the most amount of risk, and try to help them reduce their risk. So good cup quality, disease resistance. We're looking at trying to define, what does it mean for a variety to be climate resilient? We think one of the core things that needs to be looked at is how do you develop varieties that are really well suited to agroforestry, because shade matters a lot, and it's going to matter even more in the future. Higher temperatures, you need those carbon sinks, you need shade to keep the temperature a little bit lower so that the coffee matures more slowly, so that you can get the appropriate quality out of it. So you need to be able to grow coffee under shade, but all the breeding that's been done in the past has been focused on full sun monoculture, maximize yield type varieties. And so, how do you help farmers get what they need, which is, a certain amount of yield, and disease resistance, and you're not losing that yield or as much of that yield when you put it under shade, when you put that variety under shade. So these are the kinds of things, these are the kinds of questions or the things considerations we're weighing when we're thinking about how to select a variety that is going to, that might eventually be released for farmers.
That's really interesting, because I feel like when you're talking about the balance of questions that you're asking, you're not saying, hey, you should start creating striped coffee beans because people want them in, this country, or you should, plant geisha coffees, et cetera, because it's high risk. But you're factoring in this, like, what's practical for them right now and what's going to, make it more sustainable for them. And I feel like in retail, we're in a similar place where people are starting to rediscover the idea that not everything has to be, make your tongue bleed light roast.
Yeah.
We're starting to have our own conversation a little bit more with the customer, and in using that information to sort of present specialty coffee in I would say a more sustainable way, because it opens its arms to a larger group of people. What are some of the ways that in this time of discovering our own innovations in retail, what are some of the things that retail has done to positively influence what happens on the farm level?
It's a good question. So I think, I mentioned before that I think that this concept of the mice who roar, and I think that the energy that is coming from retail and enthusiasm for coffee and specialty coffee and the uniqueness of different coffees, that matters. It matters to farmers. If you are thinking about what you want the future of your land to be, what you want the livelihoods of your children to be able to see your name on a bag of coffee, your family's name, your farm's name on a bag of coffee, to know that your story is being told to someone, there's a tremendous amount of pride in that. And I think that, it's a relatively small number of farms that are, in the scheme of things, that are sort of touched in this way. But I think it's actually quite important that exists, that opportunity for farmers to have their work, valued and showcased and, highlighted creates a tremendous amount of pride, and really does create, an opportunity for people to think about having a future in coffee when maybe their neighbors are not thinking about having their children continue to grow coffee. So I think that's one kind of key thing. There's some parallel conversations, I think, that I can imagine. You mentioned, the thing that comes to mind is I think I've seen anyway, since back in 2007 when I was a barista, that there's not all of a sudden, but in the last couple of years, people are saying oh yeah, maybe we don't need to hand pour over every single drink. Maybe that's not actually A, improving quality, and B, it's definitely getting in the way of efficiency in it. And when we use a solid machine, a batch brew system that has all the right things, it might be more consistent, and it definitely frees us up to do more things. I think there's a very parallel kind of dynamic in at least the way that we're thinking about, helping coffee farmers be more efficient and thoughtful about the things that matter, and not be distracted by things that don't. And I think part of that is, unfortunately, I think it hasn't fully translated. I think there's a lot of kind of romanticism around the idea of like what coffee farming is, and, you know, heirloom varieties and all of these, that kind of notion of like coffee springing forth from nature, you know. No, coffee farms are farms. They are, coffee farmers are business people, and they have certain conditions that they need to be successful. And so I think it's totally appropriate for some farmers to really focus on, I'm not sure heirloom is even the right word, but I'll use it, like, you know, these really interesting heirloom varieties. But it's a small number of farmers where that's actually, you know, that's where they have the risk tolerance for that. And to try to push farmers to be that kind of farmer is, unless you really understand what their challenges are and what their situation is. Are they in a place that has diseases and pests and those varieties are susceptible to them? I think you really have to understand that before you start telling a farmer what it is they should or shouldn't be doing. And ideally working together with them to say, okay, this is what I'm hoping for. This is what I want. What are your constraints? And let's kind of work it out together. It's sort of like the idea that like anyone who does anything anymore, right? You have a computer and you run your business in part off of that computer. Coffee farmers, a lot of the varieties that are in the ground now, most of the varieties that are in the ground are effectively the same ones that have been growing, and they're not genetically diverse. For hundreds of years, it would be like asking your business to like run on stenography instead of on, you know, the latest Mac operating system. Like, yeah, exactly. It doesn't make any sense. And it really does do a disservice to farmers to kind of keep putting them into this like romanticized, you know, as I said, sort of spring forth from nature, sort of box. Like, no, they're modern, business people, and they need to be able to make decisions that are going to enable them to thrive and succeed.
So in your RICO talk, you've hinted at this right now, and I'd like to dive deeper into it. You're talking about coffee, the plant coffee is the core technology in our industry, and that it's slightly under-innovated. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it is under-innovated. I mean, it really doesn't matter what you do in coffee, whether you're a barista or you have designed some, you know, fancy new grinder, or, you know, it doesn't matter what your business is. If you make money from coffee in any way, your business is dependent on the success of the coffee farmer and the plant. It is just contingent on their success. And so everyone has a stake in this question of how do we help coffee farmers thrive? How do we help the plant, which is their kind of core asset and core technology, thrive? So, you know, people have been improving coffee plants, coffee seeds for a long time. Agriculture itself is, has been around for well over 10,000 years. And we have always been selecting and breeding and improving it using similar systems of kind of decision-making and thinking and choice-making to improve any technology. So coffee is a thing that can be improved. And when I say improve, you know, what does that mean? Well, it's what I was talking about before. It's what are the needs of farmers? What are the needs of consumers? You kind of figure out who are the people who have skin in the game. What do they need? You can work to design a plant that will meet those needs. And I think, you know, people get uncomfortable when you say the word design and plant in the same sentence. Right. I am talking about using traditional breeding techniques. So, you know, it looks very naturalistic. It's like taking a little bit of pollen from one and painting it onto the stamen of another. And, you know, you're helping the plant reproduce and have sex. You've assisted in the process, but it's still effectively a natural process. I'm not at this point in time talking about genetic modification, which we have a policy against and don't do in our breeding program. But you can still, you know, decide that there are certain traits that you want to emphasize, and you can select for those. So you make a whole bunch of new varieties, and then you look at which ones are most closely adhering to the set of traits that we decided are the ones that we want. And that is effectively a design process, right? And so you can design a coffee plant that is going to be more effective or have the traits that a farmer needs or that a consumer needs, or both. And those needs are going to differ depending on where in the world the farmer is and what challenges they face. the issue is that given the global importance of coffee and the massive economic impact that it has in the world, the huge, tremendous number of people that it employs and provides livelihoods to, a surprisingly small amount of work has been done on this when you compare it with other crops that are much less valuable than coffee. Much more work has been done. And that dynamic exists for a bunch of reasons, but the kind of fundamental underlying one is it's grown in poor countries and it's consumed in rich countries, and the places where it's consumed have not so far really felt the impact of that lack of investment. And I think that is beginning to change. So with the leaf rust epidemic, with the sort of acceleration of problems related to climate change, with better ability for a barista or a consumer to kind of peer into the life or the lived reality of a coffee farmer and say, oh, that's not good enough. Before it was just black. It was a black box. We didn't know what their lives were like. And we can see that now. And we have the opportunity to say it needs to be better. So all of those are reasons why very little investment over time has happened. The investment that has happened, I mean, it's not like no breeding has been done or no science exists around coffee agriculture. A lot of it exists, but it has all primarily been funded by public governments in coffee producing countries. The situations of many of those governments have changed and evolved. There's less funding than there used to be. Coffee is a relatively smaller part of their economies in many countries than it used to be. There's countries like Brazil where like 95% of their economy used to be coffee. Well, Brazil's a modern country, like a lot. It's still it's the biggest producer of coffee in the world, but there are other more important parts of the economy now. And so there's relatively less government support than there used to be. So all of those dynamics are sort of playing out and impacting this. And, we've luckily been able to kind of limp along for a long time. And coffee has just sort of worked. But I think that again, that dynamic is starting to change. And, World Coffee Research really was brought into being or came into being because a group of pretty, I think, wise people sat down and said, there is probably a role for the private sector here. It is probably not enough, and it is probably also not right for the public governments of coffee producing countries to shoulder the entire burden of funding this stuff when our businesses are built on it. So there is I think it's more business minded in many cases than that. It's like, we'd like to be a business still in 50 years. We want to make sure there's coffee. Crap. That means we got to start now because this stuff takes a long time. But I think there is also a clear, kind of ethical component to it too. And that's baked into our mission statement. And, it's very clear when you sit in board meetings with representatives of the coffee companies that support us, that's a very big part of what they are concerned about. It's both. It's the success, the long-term success of the sector and of their business in particular. And also it's, genuine concern for the livelihoods of the people who are producing coffee. And one of the things that is really cool about World Coffee Research is that it's a voluntary pre-competitive organization. So it's all these competitors, all these companies that are, out there trying to steal each other's market share, coming together at the same table and saying, yeah, but this one thing we kind of have in common. And we are not going to be able to fix it ourselves. If we as an individual company wanted to try to set up an agricultural R&D program, it would cost millions of dollars. And that doesn't make any sense. So, it's very cool. And when I'm describing this, it probably sounds like, it's all these, executives from really big coffee companies. And that's true. There are a number of, coffee companies whose names you would definitely recognize, but we also have like tiny micro roasters in Darien, Connecticut and Spokane, Washington, supporting our work. So it's a very diverse group that has sort of agreed collectively that this is a shared concern and something that if we come together, we can work together to begin to resolve some of these problems. And that's what's so cool about science and about R&D. It's like solar panels didn't exist 50 years ago. I actually don't know if that's true. Maybe they did, but they didn't exist 200 years ago. It's a new thing. It's something that we brought into being through the power of our minds. And that is what is really cool about agricultural research and development. It's plants, a new variety that didn't exist before. In coffee right now, there's an entire new class of coffee varieties that never existed before, called F1 hybrid varieties. And like 30 years ago, you couldn't have imagined that would really exist for coffee. And so who knows, this is the thing that I love about it. It's like, what 50 years from now, what amazing technology is going to exist that we can't even conceive of at the moment.
Right. You're really just enriching my perspective on this and all of our perspectives on this, creating this idea that, this conversation has to keep going, or else, these plants are not going to just take care of themselves. They have to be cared for by the community and not just the producing community. So, we in the retail world can read the stories and we can hear the talks and we can assume easily after that we can't do anything about it actively. So many a barista will learn about a coffee for their competition routine, but feel powerless to do anything about it, more than just, give credit to the farmers, et cetera. And large companies can do the exact same thing by giving credit to the farmers, but I have a feeling that there's more that can be done that's not just a knee-jerk reaction, but as an actual sustainable reaction towards sustainability. Mm-hmm. So it makes me want to ask the question, like, those of us who are baristas and managers and owners and roasters, what are some of the things that we can do as we discover more about the world of the coffee plant, its core technology, that will make a big difference in its sustainability?
I think the single, in some ways, least material but single biggest thing that people can do is stop dissing sustainability. Somehow the conversation in specialty coffee got so oriented towards quality, and I understand why. People were trying to differentiate their product from what had come before, which was this, kind of unilateral focus on organic and fair trade and certifications. And those are, I think, basically necessary but not sufficient components of what it means to have a sustainable agricultural sector for coffee. But I think the mistake that people made was thinking like, oh, that's all sustainability is. It's not. It's so much more. A focus on quality can absolutely be a component of sustainability. But I really, like, I've heard, and I'm sure people who are listening have heard, like, just straight up dismissals of any sort of attention or focus on sustainability. And then there's the more kind of subtle nuanced stuff where you're not straight up being like, but where you're kind of like, well, it's not organic. It's organic by default because these farmers are too poor to put fertilizer on their thing. And they're kind of holding that up as a value. Like, the farmers are too poor to make investments in their farm, and that's a good thing. That's not a good thing.
Wow. You know what? I'm sorry, but I have said those words before in just because I've heard that, and I thought that makes sense. I'm more concerned that the customer knows it's organic, and I'm not impacted personally by the fact that these farmers, I mean, do you hear yourself, Chris? They're poor.
Yeah. I mean, it's I get it, right? Because it's the culture, it's the water we all swim in. We have so internalized the idea that coffee farmers are poor that it's okay. And it just doesn't have to be that way. I mean, it is the way it is, and it will be that way for a long time. But I think if we just begin to shift our perspective, that no, there are approaches, there are ways that we can change our own businesses to begin to change that dynamic. And I think absolutely one of the core most important things is consumer demand. So consumer demand for quality, consumer demand for sustainability, having consumers be able to say like, yep, that's what I want. That really does change things. And I think, I'm not going to tell your listeners like what their definition of sustainability should be. I mean, there's some pretty agreed upon definitions, in the world at this point. But it's that pillar of social, economic, and environmental sustainability. Those three things do have to be in place. And in some ways, economic sustainability might need to be a priority for coffee for a little while, because if people can't make a living growing coffee, they're not going to do it. Or if it doesn't meet their economic needs, they're not going to do it. And I think, that's definitely, there's a lot of concern about like the next generation of coffee farmers. Who are they going to be? Are there going to be enough of them? So I think that's one thing that people have total control over, right? Just embrace sustainability. Do it in the way that makes sense for you and for your business, but don't diss it. Another one is, and this is like might sound kind of tangential, but I believe this. So yeah, if you're a barista, you don't have a lot of control over the one coffee farm of maybe 20 that your cafe is buying coffee from. You don't have a lot of direct connection to that. So what do you have control over? You have control over your cafe and the cafe environment. And I mean, let's just be totally blunt about the fact that climate change is probably the biggest long-term sustainability threat to coffee producers. Where does climate change emanate from? It emanates from us. We are the largest producers of carbon in the world. If you look at carbon footprint analyses of the coffee supply chain, 50% of the carbon footprint of coffee comes from the cafe. Not even the roastery, the cafe. That is something that we have all a tremendous amount of control over. There's all sorts of little things that you can do to impact that. The SCA has a really great guide called the Green Guide that's about, how to make your cafe more carbon neutral. There are lots of great organizations that focus on actual carbon neutrality. Like that, I know it sounds, I think some people feel like it feels inadequate or sounds inadequate, but that is the place where you have power. So use it. Just there's this kind of general idea. There's a really great conference happening right now in Portland called DazzleCon. And it's about encouraging a culture of startup companies and new tech companies that are not focused on being unicorns, but with their kind of self-adopted identity as be a zebra, which is rewarding quality over quantity, creation over consumption, sustainable growth over, trying to sell to the 10x, it's 2x, not 10x, shared prosperity over shareholder profit. Like if you're a part of a company, you can have an influence on company culture and on the values of your company. And I think all of that actually does matter and it adds up in the aggregate. Push your company to be a zebra company, learn about the issues that impact coffee farmers. And there are lots of opportunities to be part of collective action type networks in coffee. There's World Coffee Research. Like anybody can support our work. So that's great. Come do that. Be part of that. There are all sorts of other organizations out there that are doing really great work in the coffee lands and that are tackling issues that are much bigger than any one retail cafe can tackle alone. Or even, a reasonably large roasting company can tackle alone. Like our work is supported by some of the largest coffee roasters in the world, and they are not big enough to do the work that we're doing. So I think just recognizing that it's not a bad thing to be part of something bigger, differentiate, be the unique business that you need to be, but participate too.
It sounds like we need to be patient with change, because if we rush, then it's likely you're missing something, or you like try to tell somebody what to do, or like a farmer and you have no idea what you're talking about. You just want to make a difference, but you're actually hurting something and not helping it because you haven't given yourself the time to understand the problem before trying to solve it to absolve your conscience of guilt.
Yeah, that's a pretty eloquent way of putting it. I mean, we work on timelines that are even longer than many other organizations that are out there doing work in the coffee lands. Research takes a really long time. And that can be really challenging. We're like, I can't tell you the number of times we're like, okay, when do we get to taste your varieties? And I'm like, in 10 years?
You won't be alive.
It's a really long time. On the other hand, think of it this way. So we have done now some modeling work to look at what the impact of climate change might be on where people are able to grow coffee in the future. And it doesn't look great. It looks like basically by 2050, there's going to be about half as much land will be suitable for growing Arabica coffee as is suitable now. And but 2050 sounds like a really long time. I don't know. It just sounds like an abstract, like far away number. Until I was doing a talk on this and I was trying to think about how can I help people, understand that number in a different way. And so let's see what it's 2017 right now. That's 33 years from now. Most people in coffee, many of your listeners, I'm imagining, are in their like late 20s, early 30s, or early 20s to mid 30s. I'm in my mid 30s myself. Like 2050 is inside the span of my professional career. Mm-hmm. I will not hopefully have retired the work that I'm doing in coffee by 2050. All of a sudden, it starts to feel much closer, I think, to think about that the decisions, the actions, the efforts that I participate in now are the impact of that will be felt inside the span of my career, the time that I have spent on all of this. It's not just about like a future generation, although it is about that. And we have to think in that way. I love the concept of thinking 7 generations out, right? Like how different would everything be if that's what we did?
Yeah. Well, we don't think that way about hardly anything in our normal lives.
No. But I think I'm sure there are, coffee companies, retail companies that start and they kind of from the beginning start with the idea of like, my goal is to get bought out by a bigger company. But I think most of the people that I know in coffee they're just captivated by coffee and this is the life they want for themselves. And, I think most people would say like, I do want to build a sustainable business. I do want to build a business that's going to last. And so, what is that beginning to, there's all sorts of things you have to think about, just to run a cafe along those lines, human resources and all sorts of things. But one of the things that I hope people do think about a little bit is, well, what about the coffee itself? Where's it going to come from? And how do we think about making sure that it exists in the future? And it's too big of a problem to solve on your own, of course. But I think what is cool is that coffee is maybe a little more organized than most commodity crops around asking these questions and finding ways to try, setting up collective action networks to try to resolve them. Like I like to joke, but I've never been to a sugar conference, but I guarantee you it doesn't look anything like the SCA Expo. Where people are talking about issues like forced labor and sustainability and ethical issues. And, I really appreciate being part of a community that is oriented around community, right? Because that in and of itself is supportive of a kind of sustainability, and around some of these larger questions. I think it's easier to touch into it in coffee than it might be in other places. And there's still plenty of room to decide what it means to you for your particular business or your particular role in your company.
It sounds hopeful. Like within the span of our careers, for a lot of us, we could see substantial change. We can be a part of that change. And there are organizations like yours that are available for input. People can support that. And the information is just readily available and convenient. So I look forward personally to learning more. As I was looking into more of this information for this episode. It's just like, man, I can see down that rabbit hole that you're talking about. Who knows?
It's there, and it's like, I'm just like, I'll get like mildly political for one moment. I think it's so much better than it was, the sort of culture of coffee than when I first started. I can remember going to like latte art throwdowns and it totally felt like a middle school dance. There was like a bunch of dudes, kind of aggro dudes, and like 3 girls like standing at the back. But I think that if people in coffee, if baristas cared as much about the coffee plant and the coffee farmer as they care about their grinders, a lot would change. And I think that it's one of the things that frustrates me sometimes when I look at a component. I mean, it's clearly, obviously, I'm generalizing at this point, but like a scientific paper gets published on grinding and people are like super involved and engaged and having these conversations and these debates, and they're spending all of this time, this mental, emotional capacity on dissecting this tiny, tiny little thing that at the end of the day maybe changes a flavor profile a little bit. Mm-hmm. And there's just not the same attention and enthusiasm to what comes before that has a really, really big impact on quality, on livelihoods, on sustainability, on the business as a whole, on the sector. So I look for, I don't mean to I didn't want to drag us back down, but in a way, at that kind of attitude of sort of care and attention to all of it. I don't mean don't be excited about grinders, go be excited about grinders. It's totally great if that's your thing. But expand your enthusiasm if you can, because it is interesting. There's so much to learn. It's just infinite. Mm-hmm. It is, and it's really open for everybody's, I don't know, the more people that are applying their incredible, passionate curiosity to these bigger questions about coffee, the better. And I know that it's there. I mean, it's amazing to me how passionate people are about grinders. So that's amazing. Let's harness that and extend it a little bit.
Excellent. No, I'm really happy that we're ending on this idea that let's expand, let's learn, let's expand our horizon a little bit, because that's exactly what I thought when I heard you talking about core technology being the coffee plant and how obsessive we are. Everything I heard from Host Milan coming back, or I saw on Instagram, had to do with, aesthetics, mostly aesthetics, mm-hmm. and some functionality of things that in the end, it's like, wow, what Hanna is saying in this talk versus, and what that yields versus what these machines yield is such a disparity. But it sounds like we are seeing the tide turn slowly over time, so that attention is given a little bit more so every year to the coffee plant. And you're not asking people to be experts in this, right?
No, oh my gosh, it would be impossible. Right. It's too much. I'm no expert, I've spent 10 years thinking about these things and I still feel like I have, a high school diploma in it. So, but, and I'll just say on the topic of aesthetics, maybe as a way of kind of wrapping up, care and sustainability and an attitude of attentiveness is aesthetically beautiful. It is. And we just have to find ways to capture that. I think, it's hard to capture that in an Instagram photo. But it's also not, because what else is latte art, right? That it is an expression of care and attentiveness to the drink that you're serving someone. And so just expanding that a little bit, the field of vision to be, not just stop at what's in the cup, but include the story and the people that came before it. I think it's very possible. I am very hopeful. I think coffee is it really does have the potential to be, one of the world's sustainable crops that has that potential. So let's do it.
Excellent.
Let's make it that way.
Yeah. I'm on board.
Okay, good.
Great. So how can people get in touch with you and stay up to date what's going on with World Coffee Research and everything else in this world of coffee sustainability? Yeah.
So I'll just in terms of our own organization, worldcoffeeresearch.org, we have a ton of information on our website. We are pretty much publish everything that we do open source. So, the coffee lexicon you can download for free. The coffee varieties catalog that we produced for Central America, download it for free. Same thing, we're going to have an African coffee varieties catalog available in February. Nice. So the website's a great resource. We have a mailing list. There's, we're pretty active on Facebook and Twitter, and hopefully soon more on Instagram. So you can kind of follow along with our work in all of those ways. Certainly anyone who's interested in becoming a member, you can find information about that online, and you just get more emails with more information if you do that. And there's other great organizations. So part of it is just thinking about, what is your definition of what matters to you? Is it gender in coffee? Is it water issues? There are great organizations that do that work. So I don't know, Google it. I can name a few, Catholic Relief Services and their Blue Harvest Initiative, CQI and their gender initiative, participating in, whether it's SCA or whether it's independently organized coffee community kind of conversations and going to those, day-long learning events with speakers. Like coffee's got a million ways now of learning and engaging. So I think all of those are great opportunities. And, people are already doing that to some degree, right? They're listening to this podcast. So that's part of it.
Yeah. Super. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all that. I know I learned a lot, and I'm just thrilled to have you present that information here on the show. It's super helpful, and I hope that we can, all leave here and just make a difference.
I hope so too. And I don't mean to be Pollyanna-ish about all of it, but if we don't try, who is going to? Nobody. Mm-hmm. It's our world. It's our culture. It's our community. So we really do have a tremendous amount of power in that. And I hope people feel that they have a role.
Absolutely.
You do.
Yeah. And thank you for your work.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to coming back one day and telling you more, talking about some other angle of things. It's been really great to be on.
Well, I really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope that you did as well. I feel like, the importance of this topic can't be understated. And the more I think about and read about and talk about this subject, the more it just shocks me how little I've thought about this over the years of my career in coffee, only because it's not readily, it's not in front of me. It's not something that I see all the time, and therefore I just don't think about it. But now as more information comes out and we have more resources available to us through organizations like World Coffee Research, the excuse for not knowing more about what's happening on the farm level is all but gone for the most part, especially in specialty coffee. One of the huge points in this conversation that I really walk away with, constantly thinking about is the idea that so much of our progress in the industry hinges around healthy communication and understanding the needs of one another. Whether it's the coffee farmer understanding the needs and desires of the consumer and the retailer who purchases the coffee, or it's the coffee retailer and consumer understanding more the story behind coffee and the needs of the farmer and what we can do on our end to have a massive impact on the vitality of their vocation. Now, as we think more about this and you see the ends of the loop talking more and more and linking up more and more, that's really encouraging. Communication to the farmer about what roasters want based on what the consumer wants. And we need to make sure we are really connected to our customers in that. Some of the things that we can do to really help shape the future of the coffee plant and really the future of this industry is a lot of the things that we already are doing, but doing them with a greater perspective on their impact. So the importance of having great service and consistency and hospitality and quality and communicating about coffee effectively to consumers, this all informs the habits and demands that consumers have in the market. Years and years from now, people will make decisions about their purchasing based on interactions they have in our stores tomorrow or yesterday or whenever. So how we talk about coffee and the messaging that we put out there impacts consumer behavior. And that's really going to secure the future, or it's going to threaten it in some ways. All of these things, being good stewards of our resources, having great service and consistent quality for consumers, great hospitality, and communicating well, all of this is going to serve to invest and sow seeds of sustainability for the future. And I think it's a helpful word picture to think this is really what we're serving. We're serving the coffee plant to people every day. What it is that we get in the cup comes directly from the farm. and whether or not that is going to be around in the future really depends on us. It depends on the actions we take, the understanding we gain, and my thanks to Hanna today for coming on the show and helping us with our understanding and inspiring us to further education and action. You can find a ton of information by going to worldcoffeeresearch.org and learn about the work, what they're working on now. They've got a lot of free resources as well. And in the show notes, I will be linking to videos on YouTube where Hanna is given talks at the RICO Symposium at the SCA conference. Now, if you want to know more about Keys to the Shop, you can go to keystotheshop.com. There we have all of our past episodes available for you to listen to, as well as the show notes from those episodes. And if you want to reach out to me directly, you can do so by emailing chris@keystotheshop.com. Always love hearing from you and how this show has impacted you, questions that you have about the industry. Maybe I can help you out in some way. It would be my honor to. So thanks again for joining me on the show for number 60 at Keys to the Shop. It's been a really great time, and take this information today and really let it settle into your mind and let it inform the decisions you make as a barista, as a manager, an owner, a roaster, or wherever you find yourself in coffee retail. We are serving the coffee plant to people. The fruit of this tree its future is in our hands. And I hope that this episode today will have had some small part to play in helping secure the future of this drink we love, and also that it did in fact give you keys to the shop.